Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Back to Square One podcast. Today, we have a very special guest for all our listeners, and he's known as the guy that gets multiple hate comments on YouTube for his own podcast on stuff. Apparently, he doesn't like science. We have no idea why we have him on here, even though we may think that his company or his podcast, Stronger by Science, maybe just a front for his actual secret desires. Welcome, the one and only Greg Nuckols, to the podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so Greg, I know I've definitely overinflated your CV there just now, so perhaps you can provide any form of correction and maybe let our listeners know a little more about who you are, what do you do, and yeah, just take it from there.
Yeah, well, I guess I only have one correction. To be clear, the name Stronger by Science podcast is purely meant to be ironic. Science is fake. No one ever got strong from PubMed. It's a pretty clear bit, and I don't understand why so many people fail to pick up on that sarcasm.
I know, like it's pretty straightforward, right? Like we don't really need the science to get stronger. You know, the evidence is there.
Yeah,
it's set in stone.
you just lift weights and just train a little bit harder every single session, right? Just repeat, rinse, repeat, and that's basically how you do it. Who needs science anyway?
Well, yeah, to paraphrase the great Bill O'Reilly, weights go up, weights go down. Can't explain that. Yeah, I mean, and people listening may be wondering, like, why I went to grad school for exercise science. In the industry, that's what we call committing to a bit. You know, lots of people will make jokes. Most people aren't willing to invest 2 years of their life into a joke. So yeah, that's it's pretty much all you need to know about me, I reckon.
Yeah, I'm glad you managed to leave in the 2-year mark and not commit yourself to.
Unlike Kedrick, who wants to take the joke, a running joke, a decade actually. How long has your joke been, Kedrick?
I have no idea. My life this time pretty much is a joke. So, and yes, so it is quite hard to count or quantify the, yeah. But I think that something our listeners would be really like intrigued to know about yourself is, I know that in the popular like online fitness scene, you wear many hats. You have a lot of expertise regarding different topics, primarily in dissemination and looking at research and stuff like that. Perhaps you can maybe share about what you actually did in grad school, because you mentioned grad school just now. So, you know, for the listeners out there, you usually go to grad school, you do something really specific, right? Then what did you look at during your time in grad school?
Yeah, so my the topic of my thesis research was sex differences in fatigability during resistance training. So yeah, that's the short version, and then the long version is like 30 minutes. And I figure that this probably isn't the ideal medium for that. But yeah, the biggest thing I was interested in was sex differences in fatigability.
Yeah, because I mean, obviously, I know a little bit about your research because we've had chats along while you were doing it. After you finish, we had like we catch up like maybe once a year or something like that. But our listeners out there might not have an idea on that specific area, because like I said, you wear many hats. You know, you have you blog on Stronger by Science. You have the Stronger by Science podcast. You also are involved in the mass research review. So you do wear many different hats. I do think that right now, since you potentially have multiple different areas of like research, what is your current interest, right? When it comes to research, it could also, your current interest could be due to your personal interest, or maybe just like responsibilities of your job. Like, cool, I'm allocated this kind of research to look at the journal suite for maths every single month. So
I'm obligated.
yeah, so
it's not something I enjoy.
Yeah, it could be personal or it could be an obligation. So what is your current like sort of like area of interest for like exercise science research?
Well, yeah, I mean, so since this is my job now, my areas of interest largely have to overlap, I think, with what I'm doing professionally. I don't have that much time just for pleasure reading anymore. So now we're doing a hard ad pivot, putting out a nutrition app soon.
I
it's
saw
going to
that.
be called
I signed up
Macro
to it.
Factor. Oh, hell yeah.
Hell yes.
Anyway, so by extension, most of the reading I've been doing relates to human metabolism, which honestly bums me out a little bit because I don't care about that quite as much.
As you might have picked up from Greg, like he's one who just likes to lift weights. Metabolism isn't part of getting stronger and eat. Yes, we'll talk about that a little bit.
Great food, yeah. So sorry to interrupt, but continue.
Yeah. So to be clear for anyone listening, that's like, well, if this guy's just now reading a lot about human metabolism, why would I sign up for his nutrition app? Eric Trexler, other guy involved, that is his area of expertise. But since we're developing it together, I don't want to be completely dead weight in the process. So yeah, I've been mostly learning a lot about human metabolism recently, just to make sure that all of our algorithms are tuned just right. And the thing that's like a little bit frustrating about it is currently primarily what we're doing is trying to make sure that our predictive algorithms work as well as they can just based on like what is known in the literature currently. But one of the people involved in the app is like a artificial intelligence and machine learning researcher. It's like once we get a lot of users, we're going to tweak all of our equations anyways based on the actual data we have coming in to fine tune them further. So yeah, doing what someone might call a completely unreasonable amount of work, reteaching myself little bits of calculus that I haven't had to mess around with in the past decade, to dial in equations and algorithms that will probably only exist in their current state for probably like the first month of the app's life. But yeah, I mean, we are nothing if not excessive when we undertake a project. So yeah, that's the biggest thing I've been up to recently.
That's really cool, Greg. And yeah, definitely looking forward to when that comes out. I'm sure that as the world evolves, I always use this analogy to people, one day MyFitnessPal is going to shut down. Eventually it's going to be taken over by the overlords, and we definitely need another platform, not just to count macros, but potentially do a little bit more than just finding foods. But I guess in the question for you there, and obviously Greg being obviously playing a big role in mass alongside all your other colleagues there as well, you mentioned about relearning, particularly metabolism and things like that in relation to the app. As someone who's already gone through grad school, obviously you had that big experience of like studying and learning, and now we're kind of getting back into learning again. Like, how could you maybe talk a little bit about your relationship with, I guess, learning? For context, mass is like a really good platform as well for those who want to learn a little bit more about strength training in general. But what's your experience like from learning now compared to learning before? Is it the same, different?
I don't know. I think it's basically the same. I learn and retain things pretty easily. And when I'm like re-exposed to something that I had previously learned, Generally, my memory is jogged pretty quickly. I'm sure that will change with age, but currently everything's still running fairly smoothly. I mean, if anything, I think it's probably easier now just because I know more about how to vet sources and read research. So, that's certainly helpful. I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm not fully understanding the question you're asking.
Oh, I mean, well, I guess to give you context, when an individual first goes into like college and stuff like that, they have this, I guess, potentially false sense of security or insecurity about what they're getting themselves into. And they might think like, oh, first year is going to be really difficult, or second year is going to be like the worst. But then coming out of that experience and getting that, let's be honest here, that degree, which doesn't really mean anything when it comes out to the real world. And then now actually learning, I guess in your case, not just for the sake of learning, but more so learning because, hey, I'm actually learning to develop an app, not for the sake of getting just a piece of document that I don't know what will happen, 5 years later. Like, do you feel that it drives you? Does it make the learning process a little bit more palatable, knowing like there's an actual tangible outcome versus going to grad school where you're like, I don't know what life will be after that. There's a dream, but
No, so that's a good question. And actually my grad school experience was different than that because I did undergrad and then I was, out working for 4 or 5 years before I went back to grad school. So when I did go to grad school, there was less of that unknown, like, oh, what am I going to do with this in my life? Like, I knew why I was going to grad school and what I wanted to get out of it. So it was like a more directed thing. But thinking back to undergrad, I think 2 big takeaways and 2 things that I don't know. I don't have a good way to frame the things I'm about to say, but 2 main points. One, I think something that helped me out a lot was when I went to undergrad initially, I wasn't an exercise science major. I was a history and religion major, and the thing about both of those courses of study is it's like 98% reading. So so I remember when I switched to exercise science, when I switched my major, we'd get assigned like a research paper to write and be like, hey, you're going to write about this thing. Like, let's say like pick some disease state and write 7 pages about exercise prescription for people with some particular disease, and like make sure you have at least 10 sources or something like that. I remember like the other people in my class would be like, 7 pages, what the fuck, 10 sources, where am I going to find those? And that seemed like a relatively large assignment for the other people in my exercise science classes. But it's just like, dude, as a history major, a pretty common assignment would be like, all right, so you're going to write 25 pages about gender roles in the workforce in the 1950s in France. And you need to have at least like 8 books to cite and like 27 newspaper clippings. Like, how to use the microfiche in the library. And if you need to get like an interlibrary loan from Paris, like make sure you get on that quick so you have time to write it. And by the way, it's due next week. So that was just like normal ass history stuff. And so I think that, and I basically finished the major. I got to the senior capstone class and then realized like, oh shit, I don't actually want any of the jobs I can get with this degree. Because I don't plan ahead for anything. And so that's when I switched to exercise science. But from going through that experience, and like religion is the same thing. Like it's people reading old books and writing about old books. But yeah, so I think that helped a lot with learning basically anything, because now like my default assumption is like, oh, I want to learn about something new. I don't think like, hey, I'm going to try to find a review paper that will break this down for me. My assumption going into it is like, well, okay, I'm going to spend about 4 or 5 solid days reading several hundred pages of material about this thing for me to feel like I've barely gotten my feet wet. And I think that is not a reasonable expectation for someone whose full-time job isn't creating content. But I think that that's more or less what should be expected if that is primarily what you do. And so I think having a history background helped a lot with that, because that's, that was the research process, like, not like doing research in a lab, but like researching a topic. You learn that you should expect that to be a really intensive and time consuming process. And I think a lot of people in fitness don't go into learning about a new topic with that expectation. Let's see. The other thing, yeah. So you mentioned, maybe not necessarily knowing what you need to learn and what you need to retain when you're going through formal education. I think that's definitely true. I was never the type of person who would sit in class and think like, where am I going to use this in the real world or whatever. Like I remember kids in like math class growing up being like, when am I ever going to have to use algebra in the real world? Like algebra's, I don't know. I think it's really useful. But anyway, I was never that person. I was always the type of person that just assumed like, well, I've got to get the grades. So who cares if I'm ever going to use it? I need to learn it anyways. But when I did go to grad school, it was quite a bit different because I did already have a career track, right? So I knew what I needed to know for my day-to-day job, my day-to-day life, and what the gaps were and things that I really needed to fill in. And so like, I do think that helped a lot, because then I did know like, well, okay, like these classes I should study more for, because I know I'm going to use this stuff later. So I need to really, really master it. And these other classes, like, yep, I'm taking this as a pass fail. I don't care about the letter grade. I know that I don't need to know this stuff, So I do think that helped with kind of like the focusing process. And like, yeah, when you get out in the world, I think that a useful distinction that anyone who's done both research and has worked in industry is aware of, is that there's a difference between like science and application to some degree. Like, ultimately you can have an enormous amount of book knowledge, but if you can't actually apply that in a way that is useful to people and will help them get the results they want, it's not good for much. And so I do think that influences the way that I read and interpret research to some degree. So a good example of that is something that's getting a lot of attention in the research right now, which I think is really cool, is ischemic preconditioning. So essentially what that is like, if your listeners have heard of blood flow restriction training, it's a similar concept, except instead of only occluding venous blood flow, you're occluding arterial blood flow. And instead of doing it during training, the way that ischemic preconditioning works is you'll occlude all blood flow to your limbs for 5 minutes, and then take the wraps off for 5 minutes, let yourself reperfuse, and then repeat that 3 times. And that, so the history of ischemic preconditioning is both somewhat gruesome and also pretty interesting. So it was initially discovered by, I'm blanking on the researcher's name, but he was doing heart attack research in dogs. and had a couple sets of dogs open their chest up and did ischemic preconditioning for one of their cardiac arteries for several rounds, 5 minutes occlusion, 5 minutes reperfusion, and the other group of dogs just opened up their chest for the same period of time, but didn't do the ischemic preconditioning, and then just mechanically gave the dogs a heart attack. So cut off blood flow to that particular artery for 40 minutes, and then look to see how much of the myocardium was damaged in the ischemically preconditioned dogs versus the ones that hadn't been. And the ischemic preconditioning pretty dramatically reduced the area of necrotic tissue in the hearts of the dogs that had been exposed to ischemic preconditioning. And that was like back in the 80s. That was pretty old research. But more recently, it's been applied to resistance training performance. So, if you do ischemic preconditioning for your legs before a squat or a leg press workout, will that help you complete more reps, have better strength endurance, and possibly even recover faster from training by mitigating muscle damage to some degree? And it actually seems to work pretty well. Like there are 8 studies, I believe, on ischemic preconditioning in a resistance training context so far. And 6 of them have pretty unmitigatedly positive results, and the other 2 have mixed results. So some of the measures are pretty positive in favor of ischemic preconditioning, and some are more neutral. But yeah, so overall, that seems like a really promising area of the research. But then, I think about it practically as a coach, and I'm like, would I ever use this with any of my lifters? And the answer is no, because dude, you're training someone who has other things going on in life. Oftentimes one of the challenges people run into is to get in the level of training volume they need to keep making progress. Their gym sessions, which used to be an hour, are now pushing an hour and a half. And that's cutting into time with their kids or time that they could spend studying or whatever else. And it's hey buddy, now you need to show up to the gym an extra 30 minutes early so you can put knee wraps around your legs. Yeah, so you can put knee wraps around your legs and just sit there for 5 minutes and then repeat that 3 times. So it's one of those things that is academically very interesting and pretty promising. And I could see having applications in some very niche things. So for example, if you were doing a squat reps competition in a strongman show or something, and you have 30 minutes of downtime before your flight is up, ischemic preconditioning very well could be a intervention that could help you eke out another 2 reps on the squat, which could be the difference between a podium finish or not. But for just day-to-day training applications, I don't think it serves any purpose whatsoever, because who the fuck's going to do it, and so I don't know. I think that's one of those things that most people could come up with if they thought about it for a second. But I've seen a lot of people getting very, very excited about this. This is a game changer. It more reliably improves strength endurance than even well-validated supplements like citrulline. People are going to be doing this and performing better, and maybe they'll build more muscle. And just no, they won't. and if you actually trained people, you would know that no one was actually going to do this.
Yeah, I think.
Anyway, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I've talked far too much.
So I think that the important thing that you really drive home, and this is coming from yourself as someone who has done went to grad school, done research, so you kind of have so-called in the trenches experience of actually doing research. And obviously you are a machine when it comes to consuming information and obviously disseminating them. So it's coming from someone like that, right? Just boasting your credentials out there, just so people can take your word seriously. But all I heard was that you were trying to get PETA Animal Rights Association to protest against our podcast, because you literally talk about
cutting open dogs and restricting
dogs,
their hearts.
Yeah, but yeah, I think the big part is when I think about science, that science isn't really like normative, right? It's very like descriptive, like science tell you what is, right? It describes facts, right? Also, or like it tries to establish theories, and hopefully that, over time, becomes a fact if it's like undisputed for a long period of time. And it tells you what is, but it doesn't tell you what someone ought to do, right? Oh, cool. Like this method gives you X result, but putting into certain context, like you said, a strong man who have 30 minutes of rest could potentially do it, but for the rest of the population, it probably doesn't really matter, right? And I think
another great example of that, if I can just cut in, is dude, there's been so much research looking at like high intensity interval training in people with like, obesity or pre-diabetes or like, general poor metabolic health. People are like, oh man, this seems to reduce waist to hip ratio better than low intensity cardio and improve blood glucose to a greater degree. Like this is really going to change the game from a public health perspective. It's like, dude, you're talking about fucking public health. Like there are millions of people who need to get in better shape. And I'm not saying that there are 0 people in the demographics I just described who want to do multiple Wingate tests per week. I can tell you there aren't millions of them. So that's another thing where like the research backing it is pretty strong, but then you think about practical application and it's like, how are you going to convince people who currently do 0 exercise to do what many people report to be the most miserable exercise? Like that's just not going to happen,
Yeah, exactly. And I think that is kind of like a good like segue into one of the questions I had in mind is like, what do you think are like the limitations of science? Obviously, one you've kind of like mentioned just now, right? And I kind of like talked a little bit, right? Is that science kind of like tell you what is happening, but it doesn't really say what you ought to do. So maybe you can share some of your thoughts. I mean, you've read probably more research than Chung and I combined.
Probably.
And maybe
I pretty much stopped research at like a few years ago, so that's where I stopped actively trying to read.
So as someone who has like read a lot, and obviously, what do you think are some of the limitations of like science?
Oh man, is this just like the limits of the scientific method period, or like the limits of, say, sports science in particular?
I mean, it can be. I guess it can be both. You can start more general from like the scientific method, then maybe go into sports science after that.
Sure. So yeah, I think limits of the scientific method. First, I guess we just need to define what science is, because I don't think science exists as a single thing. Like when someone who comes from like a biomedical research tradition, which like that's what exercise science is. It's built on the biomedical model. We mostly think like, hopefully you got some RCTs, and if not, maybe you got some epidemiological research, and like, those are the scientific methods that we use. But that's going to look very different from what, say, like an astrophysicist would refer to as science. Like you're not running RCTs on horse nebulas out there in the deep reaches of space, So, their version of science seems to largely just come down to measurement precision. So like you have your cosmological theories, and what is the most precise and accurate measurement devices you can develop to measure, down to the width of an atom, some shit that's happening 40 billion miles away, which, that's not what we do. So yeah, I mean, I think first and foremost, it's worth recognizing that like science is sociological just as much as it is like a single fixed thing, because I would argue that it's not a single fixed thing. And so I think like the first constraint of science is probably just like the frailty of the human mind, because like ultimately like there have to be things that are discoverable, are measurable, that like we just simply can't comprehend. And like I don't think we're to that point yet, but I think that it's all but a foregone conclusion that something like that probably does exist. And so I think I think ultimately like we'll probably, you know, reach a point where where scientific progress slows down, just because the number of people who can understand the cutting edge of a lot of various fields are so few and far between. And eventually like you'll reach the limits of, you know, their intelligence as well. And who knows, maybe computers will pick up the ball and run with it from there, and we'll just have to hope that they're doing good stuff, but not be able to understand it. So I think that's that will probably place a constraint on science eventually. I think that you can go in like several philosophical directions as well. So one of the things you already mentioned, Kedrick, is like science is primarily descriptive, and you know, can you necessarily derive an ought from an is? Like you can measure what is going on, but you can't necessarily tell people, you know, based on this objective data, we gathered how you're supposed to behave based on that. So, you know, it's a limited tool from that perspective. Man, I remember a few years back when Sam Harris was trying to play the moral philosophy game, just like reading moral philosophers, just pulling their hair out at how naive his understanding of science was, and its relation to the ought is distinction. So yeah, I mean that's obviously a constraint. And then I think this partially relates to I think this partially relates to what I mentioned before about human intelligence, but ultimately I think as well, science is probably constrained to some degree just by human imagination, because ultimately we research questions that we think to ask, but there must be questions that we just don't think to ask and therefore can't get answers to. And one of the ideas that I think is pretty powerful, and so I might be about to contradict myself. One of the ideas I think is pretty powerful, and I picked this up from a book called, shouldn't have said that. I don't remember the name of it. No, I do. Where Good Ideas Come From by Stephen Johnson. So one of the ideas he puts forth in that book is the idea of the adjacent possible, that basically, you know, people have this idea of like human knowledge sometimes progresses by leaps and bounds. And if you look back at history, it's like, oh, you know, we're sailing on ships guided by the wind, and then not too long later, like we have telephones and radios and stuff. Like, damn, that seems crazy. But when you look back at it, like ultimately it tends to be just a series of like small progressions, where, you know, someone discovers one little thing and then that opens the door for a couple other little things to be discovered. And then all of those things add up over time. Like basically it's the idea of like, once you get an answer, then you know what additional questions to ask. And so I think at least currently there are probably just an enormous number of questions to ask that we can't even think to ask yet, because we don't have the requisite knowledge to know to ask them. Like, we don't know that they're askable questions. And so who knows? Like, it could very well be that eventually humanity will exhaust the complete comprehensive list of all questions that are askable, and be able to sort them into ones that are researchable with science and ones that aren't. But I'm skeptical of that. I do think that ultimately we'll just be constrained by the limits of human imagination. Yeah, I mean,
yeah, I think it's
from not preparing for that question. Those are the things that immediately come to mind.
Yeah, I think there was a podcast. Funny that you mentioned Sam Harris as well. I think he recently, I say recent, it feels recent in my mind. He did I think a podcast with Neil deGrasse Tyson, I believe, an episode. I'm not too sure if you guys listened to that one, but one of the things that Neil mentioned was very interesting is that as Homo sapiens, you know, the idea is that we're only science and asking questions is only limited to what we can imagine, right, into the future. And then he goes and talk about, imagine if we were looking at an ant and they were trying to discover science. An ant might not even think about building a 20-foot building. An ant will basically try to figure out the most cutting edge technology is to move this food from this nest to that nest in a very short amount of time. And that's like their cutting edge technology. But for us, it's like, that's a car, then he goes on to talk about, imagine what it would be for science, for like life, which are not Homo sapiens. And they might look at us and say, oh, these guys are talking about, using alternative fuel to fuel their cars. But we basically just snap our fingers and we go from point A to point B in teleportation. It's that's like primitive. And I think you put it very, very nicely there, Greg. I think it's definitely limited to like human, the imagination and how much one person can tolerate. And, and like you said, when you read a paper and there's a conclusion, that then opens up doors and avenues for more questions based off the conclusion. But then it also comes down to, I guess, that idea where how many good scientists out there, are willing to go that far, because it really stretches your ability to not just come up with hypotheses, but it's basically saying like, oh, this hypothesis, I think this is true, but it might just be like a figment of my imagination, and I might not be able even to test it because it's so cutting edge. Like, there's literally no scientific method for me to do this, so I'm just gonna sort of let it sit and wait for the right time. And sometimes I guess these great ideas or great discoveries just get lost in time.
Well, I mean, one other theoretical constraint, many years into the future, is we could just be limited by human lifespans, because like ultimately knowledge builds on itself. And so like, for example, like before you learn algebra, you probably need to learn arithmetic. Before you learn calculus, you probably need to learn algebra. Before you learn physics, you probably need to learn calculus. And then, that extends out, and most of like the basics of the field you can pick up in high school or undergrad. And then most of the advanced stuff at this point, you put in another 6 years to get your PhD. Like, you should be able to pick all of that up, and then you can start doing useful and novel research in your field. But the thing is, like, it used to be a considerably shorter process when the first encyclopedias were written. They were like theoretically contained like virtually all of the scientific knowledge that at least like Europeans had at the time. And, it was the type of thing where like you could sit it down in a month, like you could sit down for a month and read it and be like, okay,
I'm the smartest man.
I know it all.
Basically.
Yeah. And so, I mean, the amount of human knowledge, both period and within a specific field, is increasing at an exponential rate. And so, currently at this point in most fields, if you've gone through the education process, by the time you're about, depending on the field, like between your mid-20s and your 30s, you will have put in enough time in a classroom to pick up what you need to know where the boundaries of knowledge in a field are, and hopefully to be able to contribute new, useful, novel stuff, right? But I mean, like, I don't think it's completely inconceivable that 50 years from now, if you want to get to the furthest limits of a field and where knowledge in that field is currently, maybe instead of getting out of school and like finishing your PhD in your late 20s, like maybe you're pushing 40, and then you just have less total time that you have to make novel contributions to your field.
That's a really good business idea, Greg. I should look to start a university and sort of grow it so that 20 basically 30 years down the road, when we're sort of pushing the boundaries of what you just said, people will actually have to stay in college and university for a decade, and it's a norm. I see a lot of potential there.
I mean, I don't think it's a completely unreasonable thing to foresee. I mean, I don't think people are going to be pushing their 40s soon. But I could very easily see, the standard model of postgraduate education progressing from, like currently around 6 years on average to get a PhD to, push that out to about 10. You're getting out around 32 instead of like 27. And I mean, as we accumulate more and more knowledge, unless there are like major breakthroughs in like neurology to where people can just download knowledge into their brains, like the stormtroopers in Star Wars, learning all of that additional stuff will take additional time, So I don't think that that's a completely implausible future to foresee, where it just ends up taking so long to learn enough to contribute novel insights that, one, the number of people who can go that route gets smaller and smaller and smaller, because currently the way society's constituted, like most people need to start earning an income sometime before their 40s. And also, like, I feel like a lot of people just wouldn't have interest in going that route. Like, speaking for myself personally, like, I could have applied to PhD programs, but I was like, no, I don't want to be getting out of school that fucking late. I want to get out and do other things. And so, I mean, I can definitely imagine a future where, like, if going all the way through the educational process to begin to start doing research, if that did take people until their mid 30s instead of their late 20s, I could see that disincentivizing people going that route, which would slow down the pace of progress as well.
True.
Yeah, it's interesting when you were talking about this. I was just thinking about something. I was just having this conversation with my girlfriend one day, and we were talking about aliens, right? I mean, people we are always fascinated with aliens. Then she asked me, "Oh, do you think aliens exist?" Right? And I just said that, yeah, if aliens exist, I think that we won't find them. Like, they will come to us and we will discover them, simply due to the fact that if we assume, right, that like the galaxies that are further away, right, like Earth, like the Milky Way is not like it's not the only galaxy in the world. So there are like galaxies further away and like light years away, right? Which means that our galaxy is like probably like younger-ish, and the aliens, for us to travel to that galaxy, is going to take ages, and we are barely like scratching the surface of space travel. But potentially the galaxies from light years away, they potentially have already started like space travel towards our galaxy. So they would like probably come into our galaxy, and we may find them. So it's like really interesting when you see things are like constrained, because if you blow it up into a big picture, we can imagine like the galaxies that are light years away have already probably began like civilization ages before we've already done, and they probably already have like space colonies in space all the way to Earth. So yeah, that's just another one of my like science fiction musing that I thought about. But it is interesting, like even when we look at the exercise science field in general, I think that yourself and obviously with your colleagues are doing a fantastic job, like pioneering open science, and that's something I kind of like want to like talk about. Because one, as a PhD student, I find the journal industry absolutely horrendous, right? That's one. And not just that, but some of them, like looking at predatory journals, obviously I'm biased because doing the journal sweep from month to month, nutrients give me is a huge pain in the butt. Like I don't understand how a company can publish 300 over journals in a month, and they also like charge for their journals. So if they charge $1,000 a journal, that's $300,000 $300,000 a month. That's absolutely ridiculous in my opinion, especially when
I think they charge $1,500.
Okay, that's even
even more.
Yeah, so it's absolutely ridiculous. So if you talk about like how science, exercise science in general is progressing, where would you see exercise science progressing in general? Because with like the accessibility to like research reviews, right? Mass, who is probably like at the forefront now. I know we have different ones like Weightology from James Krieger, the ones Heralded Research Review by Alan Aragon, and all of that. Where do you see the progress of exercise science is like in the future?
Oh man, that's a good question. I think that I think the primary constraint on exercise science currently is realistically just funding. So I think that so one of the things I mentioned before is the process of science looks different field to field, and the types of questions being asked, the types of methods being used, etc. And currently, where we're at in exercise science is mostly we're just testing groups. We're testing, 2 or 3 different interventions on 2 or 3 different groups and seeing what on average produces the best outcomes. I've been seeing more and more researchers be more and more open about reporting individual results and inter-individual variability, and maybe using like within subject unilateral designs, looking for predictors of like why some subjects may respond better to one training protocol versus another. And I think that that's probably the next step. I think that, at least on the training side of things, I can't think of a recent really big breakthrough, at least when it comes to like programming stuff, where you find another variable and it's like, oh yeah, this is another thing we can tweak, and when we tweak it this way, it does produce on average substantially better results for the vast majority of people. Most of like the basic variables to be tweaked were discovered probably in the trenches a long time ago and described in research sometime between like the 50s and the 80s. So I don't think that there's another, at least on the training side of things, I don't think there's another big paradigm shift to be had with our current research paradigm. I think the next step forward will be doing a better job of describing and predicting inter-individual variability, both in terms of gross responses, but then also like what people will respond better or worse to. And, because ultimately, like practically in the trenches, as it were, when you're coaching someone, you're coaching that individual. You're not coaching the demographic characteristics that you could use to describe them. You're coaching that person. And so ultimately you're trying to figure out like what is the best way to train this individual, like what will they respond best to. And so that's that's the question that like coaches are most interested in, and that's the question that most researchers are not interested in. And so I think as far as like training prescription goes, I think things continuing to shift in the direction that they're shifting, to get a better idea of individualized training prescription. I think that's going to be pretty big. And like I said, I think one of the big constraints there is funding. Because if you're looking for predictors of who will respond better to one intervention versus another, ultimately you probably want to be able to find like fairly clear signals. And so like you ideally would want to look for variables where, they're very strongly predictive, like R values of probably at least 0.7 plus, give or take. But since we don't know what those factors are yet, the research paradigm that would make the most sense to look for them is to just like collect a whole bunch of data, either run two groups through different training protocols and look for predictors of high versus low responders in both protocols, or use like a within subject unilateral design, separate the people who did better on protocol A versus protocol B, and look to see like what distinguishes people who did better on protocol A versus people who did better on protocol B. And so, you could collect data on like a lot of different physiological variables and look to see what's predictive. But then ultimately you're going to be discovering a lot of false positives, because that's just kind of a shotgun approach. And then you would need to verify any predictors that you did discover, but to have much faith in those predictions, you would need pretty large samples. And for the first part of that process as well, to have any faith in like the precision of your correlation coefficients, you need pretty big samples as well. Like I definitely respect and appreciate people who are doing those types of studies now with samples of like 20 subjects or something. But I ultimately think that there's not a ton of signal in the noise. And one of the reasons I think that is, less talking about individual training, like individual training prescription, and more just like predictors of high versus low responders to resistance training. There have been a lot of studies looking at that have come up with like predictors of like, oh, what predicts who's going to grow a lot of muscle versus not. And there have been a lot of studies that have reported various predictors of being a high responder. And most of those studies report different predictors. So the early stuff by Petrella and Bauman found that like satellite cell and myonuclei responses were a really, really big factor. Subsequent research has failed to replicate that. There's been a study finding that like microRNA responses were really strongly predictive of being a high or low responder. Future research has failed to validate that. One study found that androgen receptor content responses were a pretty strong predictor. Future research has failed to validate that. Same thing with ribosome responses, although 2 studies have found that now. So who knows? Maybe that's a good one. But yeah, like the difficulty that people have had to replicate those predictors, I think either speaks to the initial studies being underpowered and just finding false positives, or the subsequent studies being underpowered and failing to validate things that should have been validated. So currently that type of research with small samples, you're shooting fish in a barrel. And hopefully the dice fall in the right direction twice in a row, and you say like, okay, now we've got some good predictors.
For sure. Yeah.
So like ultimately, I think that's the direction we need to go, and I think to get there, we just need bigger samples and more funding, and that's just not a high priority currently.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's a very good point, Greg, especially sort of coming into science and looking at the future of it, specifically, I guess, from the sports science perspective. And I'm sure we can talk a lot more about this until the cows come home. But I'm sure at this point, our listener rate has probably dropped because, let's be honest, not a lot of people like to be scientists. But to kind of close out, I suppose, and I would love you to potentially answer this in 10 words or less, because, you know, I like to kind of really hone in on the core ideas. I kind of want to take it back to square one. In 10 words or less, what would you tell someone to do, or what would you tell someone to think if they want to be involved in science? 10 words or less.
I don't know if this is 10 words or less, but talk to people who are currently researchers. That would be the biggest thing. I think the process of being interested in science, and, you know, more realistically for most people, probably like headlines derived from scientific studies, I think that is considerably different than being in the lab every day doing research. The type of people who are enchanted by science journalism and the type of people who want to be a professional researcher, I think, are often very different people. So if you think you'd like to do research, talk to researchers, ask them what their day-to-day looks like, ask to maybe volunteer as a research assistant to get hands-on experience. Ultimately, I think that will tell you more than anything else to see, you know, both if maybe you're cut out for it or not, or if, you know, if it seems like a career path you would enjoy versus find completely soul crushing.
True.
Yeah, that's absolutely fantastic advice. I think that I also don't think that it's wrong for people to like say, cool, I'll do a graduate, but I won't do a PhD like yourself. And I think that's fantastic coming from someone like you. And yeah, we do need good researchers out there. And I think people who are like not cut out for it or don't like it, but just do it for the sake of doing it, won't produce good research as people who are truly invested and passionate about it. So that piece of advice is really, really useful. And we really appreciate your time. So just before we close out, for anyone else who is out there who don't know where to find you, they must be living in like a huge rock. But let them know where they can find you, and just plug all your products, right? I am going to be the first person to say that for all listeners out there,
subscribe to Mass.
Yeah, Greg's answer is actually wrong. Please subscribe to Mass. That's your first step. Do that because it's fantastic. If you like exercise science research, Mass is basically invaluable, right? You can't put a price tag on it. And other than that, let our listeners know where they can find you.
Yeah, sure. So, dear listeners, since you're currently listening to a podcast, I'm going to assume you like podcasts. So if so, check out the Stronger by Science podcast. I'm a frequent temporary guest co-host over there. The website is Stronger by Science. Let's see. If you want to join our community, there's a Stronger by Science subreddit and Stronger by Science community on Facebook. Those would probably be the best places to link up with us. And yeah, I think that's about it.
Right. Thank you so much, Greg, for your time. And for all our listeners, I hope you have found this episode beneficial. It's a little bit more nuanced, focusing on like the specific intricacy of science and stuff. But yeah, if you like this, please subscribe on whatever platform you are listening / watching, whether it's Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube. And we hope to see all of you next time.
Later.